I may have forgotten to introduce myself. I'm Nicholas Salter. I'm the Executive Director of the Provincial Employment Roundtable. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. So the idea with this panel is really just go beyond the numbers. So, Sta presented 30 minutes of numbers to you. We know numbers can be quite intimidating. There's a lot to process there. And actually this afternoon, we'll give you all the opportunity to dive deeper into data, to ask questions, to push back at some of the conclusions you saw. Those will be in the breakout sessions this afternoon. But the idea for this panel is really just to provide you a picture beyond the numbers. We've got some people on stage who hope will accomplish that. So I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves just quickly, name and sort of a bit about your background and what you do. So Dr. Borhi first.
Bonjour, hi. Alors, Richard Bourris, professeur émérite de l'Université du Québec à Montréal in psychology. Cheers.
I'm Abby. I'm the research coordinator at the Advisory Committee for English-speaking Quebecers. We are one of 8 advisory committees in the Commission des Partenaires du Marché du Travail who represent an underrepresented group in the workforce.
And feel free to grab the mic if you want. You can pass it between the two of you. Yeah. No, it doesn't come off? No. Okay.
Hello, my name is Jody Lassar. I am the Executive Director of a journalist organization, the North Shore Community Association from the Côte-Nord region. You can see some of the alarming stats was onto the screen that Steve presented about the Côte-Nord. I'm about 20 plus years working for this organization. Originally a native from some of the an isolated area of the Côte-Nord, the La Basse Côte-Nord, the lower North Shore. But I've spent my whole lifetime on the North Shore, so I have a clear understanding of the realities from isolated communities and the larger communities of Bécamo and Sept-Îles.
My name is Yigal Judah. I'm the employment coordinator at Tyndale St. George's Community Center in Little Burgundy, and I've also been working with PERT since 2020.
Perfect. So we're going to start off with a question for Dr. Borhi. So census data shows that English speakers are more likely to work a temporary position, work fewer average weeks, and are more likely to work part-time compared to French speakers. In your perspective, what do these factors mean in terms of vitality of the English-speaking community?
Okay. In short, these work trends show a decline in the economic vitality of the English-speaking communities of Quebec compared to that of the French-speaking majority. So that's something that we all understand. I want to go back to some historical points that some of you remember and others I've read about. So here's some historical points that kind of help us understand the more historical features. The economic rise of the French-speaking majority was planned by the architect of Bill 101 in 1977. The Parti québécois minister Camille Lorrain said as much to his biographer in 2003. For Lorrain, it is all about power struggle. So Lorrain said, the ultimate goal of the Charter of the French language was to ensure that more and more Francophones seize power in business, that they become the directors and CEOs, and that the Québécois economy be at last controlled by them. The economist François Vaillancourt at l'Université de Montréal tracked the ownership of Quebec economy before 1961, then right after Bill 101 in 1978, and in 1991 and 2003. This is older research, but it might also help for future studies. Here's what he found. The ownership of the Quebec economy by the Francophone majority was 47% in 1961 before Bill 101. It grew to 55% in 1978, grew again to 65% in 1991, and to 67% in 2003. Vaillancourt has done a lot of research, but he hasn't brought it up to 2023, so it'd be interesting to know where we are now. The ownership of the Quebec economy by the Anglophone minority was 39% in 1961. It declined to 31% in 1978 and declined further in 1991 at 26%, and then to 23% by 2003. That's still the Vaillancourt data. The ownership of the economy by foreign interests was 13.6% in 1961 before Bill 101. It was at 14% in 78 and declined to 10% in 2003. Clearly, the Francophone majority was gaining ownership of the Quebec economy from 1978 onwards. So what is the situation now in 2023? Of the English speakers who stayed in Quebec before 1971 and 2016, what percentage learned French to become bilingual? The census results in 1971 showed that of the English mother tongue population who lived in Quebec before Bill 101, 37% were English-French bilinguals. 30 years later, in 2001, as many as 66% of Anglophones were bilinguals, and by 2016, 69% were bilingual. And we know that younger Anglophones are even more bilingual. And of course, this data stops in 2016, but we have 2021 data coming up for that. In 1971, before Bill 101, 25% of French mother tongue speakers were French-English bilinguals. 30 years later, in 2001, 37% of Francophones were bilingual, and by 2016, 40% of Francophones were bilingual. So we have a steady increase in bilingualism amongst majority Francophones and minority Anglophones. And in a sense, that is a great opportunity because what we have is big populations of Francophones and Anglophones who are bilingual and can talk with each other everyday life, all including in the work setting, and build a lot of rapport between each other on a daily basis over and beyond the politics that we all hear about all the time around us. So this is a great potential. Now, I'll say later on a few words about bilingualism and income, but that's my point for this first little round. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So do we have anyone who wants to respond to that?
Okay. I suppose just by way of context for some of my answers, I'm currently working on a project where I interviewed 30 English-speaking Quebecers, and a lot of my answers today are going to reference that research that I'm doing and share some of the stories that people shared with me. I think in terms of the impact of community vitality, a lot of people I spoke to in my study, we're working in these sort of part-time positions or working seasonally or we're underemployed. And many people then spoke about out-migration, that they either considered leaving themselves or they'd seen a lot of people in their communities leave for further opportunity in other provinces or even the United States. And a few people that I spoke to actually felt this sort of burden of personal responsibility to maintain the vitality of their communities. So for example, I spoke to somebody she used to work in a fishery in the regions, and she was working seasonally. She was on EI for the majority of the year, as were most people in her community, which were majority English speaking. And she said she strongly considered leaving, but decided against it because she didn't want to contribute to the devitalization of her area. So instead, she actually started her own business with the explicit intent of hopefully growing it so that she could hire people in her community to work full time and contribute to the vitality of her community. And it's wonderful that people, feel this love of their community and really want to contribute to it. But hopefully, we can come up with some policy solutions that ease this burden of responsibility that some people I spoke to really felt.
Thanks for that, Abby. Jody?
On another note, when we talk about vitality of the community and a decline in the population, if I might paint a picture for the eastern part of the province in the Côte-Nord, then I'll go further east to the communities, the isolated communities along Quebec's lower North Shore, where we see fast declining populations within municipalities. We have to understand that a lot of part-time seasonal worker here. The main industry in this region is construction, whereas we have individuals leaving the province, skilled laborers leaving the province and working in the provinces of Ontario, Alberta, as far as the Northern Territories. What the vitality is that it's been going on for years and years, and raising a family is difficult when one of the parents is away for 6 months of the year. So we're seeing now that the younger families, there is a tendency that it goes on for a while and then they pick up the family and they leave. Latest statistics is shown in a couple of the local municipalities on the Lower North Shore, where in one particular municipality we see a decline of 21.1% since 2016. What is going to happen in some of these communities and eventually what we'll see is we'll probably see the community shut down. One thing will be the school. We won't have enough youth to keep the school open. So it's alarming in some of our communities where we cannot obtain full-time work because of language, because of vocational attainment in order to be on the job market. So we're sending our skilled labor outside of the province, and the impact is the vitality of the community in the long run.
Yeah, just to underscore how precarious part-time work is, we don't talk about it a lot. I think one of the reasons we've had an uptick of part-time work is because of corporations taking over smaller businesses. So as an example, my grandmother owned a typewriter store for about 50 years in Montreal. She had 2 employees, and no matter how bad things were going, she kept those employees. They were family, right? If you're working for a big corporation, if you're working part-time, there's no safety. There's no real long-term future. You're kind of part of a family, but it's not a real family. So I think it's important with these statistics to keep in mind working is not the same depending on the job, obviously. So if you have a job where you feel secure over the long term, and it's not just for the money, for the job, for the security, but for the feeling of you're part of something, that strengthens communities as well. So I think it's really, really important that the part-time and the full-time figures really be separated in data, just so people can really understand, even some of the, Uber as an example. Uber is very precarious. We've destroyed a taxi industry, and we have just people competing. It's very vampiric. People competing with each other, and the prices end up going up anyway, long term. This is usually what happens. So for an Uber driver, as an example, there's no security, and as soon as they wipe out the industry, then they can just change the rules, which is usually what happens. So it's really important, not just for the Anglophone community, but obviously we get hit harder. So.
Thanks for your comments. So as shown in the presentation, and Sta's excellent presentation, that there are greater disparities amongst the regions in Quebec, with Côte-Nord having one of the highest unemployment rates among English speakers at 17.9%. So I asked Jody first, but why do we continue to see disproportionately worse employment statistics for English speakers living in the regions, and more specifically, Côte-Nord?
Well, I think there's many factors. One of it is we have to look at what are the main industries for English speakers in the Côte-Nord region. Number one, as I said earlier, is construction. Number two, we have health and social services. And then we have retail. The Côte-Nord region is very well known for its natural resource extraction, mining, forestry, aluminum smelters, high-paying jobs. That's not where we find English speakers working. I think one of the major factors of that contributes to unemployment is that vocational attainment. There's no opportunities, there's barriers, there's gaps. There is no opportunity for English speakers to obtain these, and probably that's the reason why you're seeing in the stats that English speakers have a lower level of vocational attainment. These are skilled labor jobs, which would require some of the certification that we'll find in vocational training. Also, we have skilled laborers, and there's a tendency that they will go to Ontario, they will go to Alberta because the frustrations, the whole going through the logistics of the CCQ in Quebec, the language barrier, the knowledge, lack of knowledge of how to obtain it. So there's information. So they will just leave the province and go work elsewhere, 6 months, 4 months out of the year. We also have industry where it's fishing and hunting. So that's where it contributes to unemployment also. These are individuals that are just working a few months of the year. Tourism is starting to build on the North Shore, but this is not full-time employment. This is seasonal employment again. And especially with the cruise ship industry, it's an opportunity for English speakers because the clients are English speaking. So there's an opportunity there, but it's still not full-time employment. And the other thing we're noticing is that COVID has played a factor. We see that English speakers are working in the retail on the Côte-Nord, but since COVID, we have a lot of the businesses have basically shut down. So there's a loss of jobs there. And then I can probably contribute, because I've seen a few individuals that had these problems, is childcare. We have no childcare. The CPers, we don't have any opportunities. So you have people coming and looking for work. There's opportunities there. It's not a problem right now. There's lots of work, but we can't fill them because lack of childcare. Just in Sept-Îles alone, before COVID, we had 4 daycares that were English. When COVID came along, it shut down too. So, these are limited. I had a young girl come from Ontario that was a personal support worker, certified, ready to work. Problem was the language barrier. She couldn't work into the public health system, which was equivalent to a proposé in Quebec. And she couldn't really go to work because she didn't have childcare. There was no English childcare services, so she is unemployed and looking for a job. So, and the other thing on the lower North Shore, from talking with my colleagues through the Coasters Association, it seems to be very apparent there that there are no childcare services. So what happens is that these females, there's lots of opportunities, but they just don't apply because family is first. Raising your child is very important, so they opt to stay home, or they will do seasonal work while their spouses are back during the winter months and do seasonal work. So they do the split where they do the shared parenting. So these are some of the problematics that we're seeing in our region, I think has contributed to the high unemployment rate. And there's the gaps in services. There's a lot of gaps in services when we talk about providers in employability, service providers. There's the language barrier. Our English-speaking population is not seeking out support from service providers because number one is the lack of awareness, what's out there, and the lack of ability to help them in English. So they're not using what the government has put in place to help them to support to find full-time employment too.
Thanks, Jody. Very insightful. Abby, do you have some perhaps case studies to share or any examples to share?
Yeah, actually, I spoke to a few participants from Côte-Nord for my study. In fact, the last person I spoke about was from Côte-Nord. And I think collectively across Quebec, it's interesting you brought up lack of opportunity. I think across Quebec collectively, there seemed to be limited opportunities was something people brought up, but this was something that seemed to be exacerbated in the regions because not only are you limited, there's limited jobs already, but then you're limited again to jobs where you can speak in English. And just by way of further commentary, I'll share another story. So I spoke to someone who she moved to Côte-Nord with her husband, and initially she found a job locally, but she wanted, it just didn't really match with her skill set, so she wanted to find something different, and she just like hit a brick wall. She couldn't find anything, so she ended up working remotely from her old job in Ontario, rather than, like, she just couldn't find anything else as her only option. It's not ideal, but it was okay. And while speaking to her, she mentioned, a new job's opened up in my community, I think I'm gonna apply. And I realized that she was actually referencing the same job another participant had brought up to me independently. So I got this sense that there's a real scarcity of opportunities and, sort of competition among other people just for the same jobs. And there's a sense that there are people, the people that I spoke to at least, there are people who are looking for work, and not just, any work, but also meaningful work that matches with their skill set, or, helps them, you should feel meaning from your work. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But there's just not a lot of opportunity to find that.
Thanks, Abby. Dr. Borhi or Yigal, do you have anything to add?
I'm done.
Okay.
I guess it's not exactly the regions, but in Montreal, there are neighborhoods which are getting cut off. So we're in Little Burgundy, and come to Little Burgundy. It's a great place, but it's a food desert, as an example. So that's one thing that has an effect on everything else. Not to go too much on Jane Jacobs, but you look around your community. If there's no dépanneurs, there's no supermarkets, there's a lack of kind of stimulus for the people there. So these communities can get forgotten. It's right in the center of the city too, which is shocking, and it's physically cut off with the highway. So it's not exactly the same as the regions, but it's important to remember that where you are in the city can have a big impact. If you're far away from a metro, if you're in Lachine, let's say, you don't have a car. These are all kind of important extra factors which make a big difference for the people working.
Thanks, Yigal. I think it is important to remember that Montreal has specific geographies where the challenges are greater as well. So the next question, Yigal, is actually for you. So we did see a bit of data. Stud did present some data about visible minority status, immigrant status. But I think we want to know more about those realities and a deeper dive into the data there. And part of PERT's work actually in the coming month or so will be to publish a report looking at an employment profile for visible minority, First Nations, and immigrant English speakers. But Yigal, just if you could perhaps get into kind of the reality. I mean, the English-speaking community is incredibly diverse in Quebec, but those who are Black, South Asian, Chinese, Indigenous, from your experience in working in employment services delivery, what do unique challenges these groups face when it comes to employment?
It's a really hard question to answer. It's tricky. It's easy to go into essentialism when you start answering about groups. I'm from a very diverse background. I never know how to answer the census, to be perfectly honest. I get stuck every time. I never feel like it's accurate enough. So even in my program that we run in our PPE, I can have someone from India with an MBA, and I can have someone else from India who hasn't finished elementary school. So to put those two people in the same group isn't fair to them. It doesn't paint the whole picture. It's a problem with quantitative data. I don't want to step on Abby's next question too much, but I'm way more leaning towards qualitative data. Even if you take intersectionality into the context, you end up having groups of one person, which is quite interesting, I find. And you need more time, though, with those people. So our program is great. We have 6 months with full-time with the same people, which you get to know them really well. And sometimes it takes you 4 months before you even understand what their obstacle is. So I think, obviously, that's hard to translate into programs. The government doesn't always understand that, but that's the kind of route I can see. And we have a very high success rate because it takes that time. Once we understand what exactly is stopping that person, then we can really help them. I'm only going to talk about our population because that's what we work with. We work with a population that has extremely low income, sometimes no income. And I think I've said this in PERT meetings before. They are the most forgotten minority group, if you want, that's never spoken about. and they're actually a majority group, numbers-wise. So these are people who become invisible very quickly. I think they're the ones who require the most urgent assistance. Obviously, people are helping. There are graduates of universities who need help who are having problems, Anglophones, but they're eating. So as an example, in our program, we started a food program in our program because a lot of our participants were coming to class and they're not eating. So how can you concentrate? How are you going to get a job if you're not eating? A lot of the data one of the things shared with before was the poverty rate. I don't think that poverty rate from the census is accurate because just in the last 3-4 years, the cost of rent, the cost of food has skyrocketed for all of us as well. But imagine you're on welfare getting $800 a month. How do you survive on that? It's impossible. So I feel like empowering that group, and many of the people in that group belong to other groups that we're talking about. So, and those are the ones in those other groups who need the most help urgently. So if we can help that group, they will help all groups, all the minority groups if you want. Some of the obstacles are unique challenges. Number one would be the government. I have to be careful what I say, or my boss will tackle me off the stage. We've all talked about this many times. The bureaucracy, the time lags, the lack of understanding, and just sometimes a lack of, pragmatic action. Lots of committees, it's all great, but we need action. So that's number one. Also, it's nice to get a carrot from the government, but then if you get punched in the face with a new law the next month, it doesn't really help, So we don't really want the carrot. We want to sit at the table with everybody else and stop punching us in the face. Education for my participants is definitely the number one. Okay. Education is definitely number one. Those with a higher education always have an easier time. Language as well, but even...
That's not true.
What's that?
It's not true. Just because you have a higher education doesn't mean you can get a job.
Oh, I'm not saying that. I'm not saying... I agree. I'm just saying that those with very low education have a really hard time. Everybody has a hard time sometimes. I'm very well educated. I was always underemployed. So I'm very happy to have the job I have right now. But yeah, it's not easy for everybody. But even we've had a discussion, some warehouses looking for people, you have to have a high school diploma. Why? There's no sense in that. You don't need a high school diploma I've worked in warehouses. There's no need, So you don't need to be fully bilingual to work in a warehouse. Okay, you can have functional bilingualism. But also English classes. Have people from other countries coming, and they're professional people, and their French obviously is just starting. They're not going to learn it in 6 months, obviously, but if they don't have resources to learn English, the courses are expensive. They're usually during the day, so that's, I think, important as well to help the immigrants. And obviously mental health, drug dependency, physical health, which was very surprising when I started working at my program. I didn't realize how many people have physical health issues. I'm reading some books on that. It's astounding. And obviously that underlays everything. We were talking at the breakfast, just lack of general skills that you should be learning in school, social skills, basic communication skills is lacking as well. And the most important for people who are immigrating here are the equivalencies for their degrees. In Ontario a few days ago, for engineers, they passed, they're allowing engineers, which is fantastic. Will Quebec follow? They need to follow these. I have so many people who are ready to work, they want to work, they're great people, and they want to move to Ontario now. They don't want to stay here, so let's keep them, they're great. Thank you.
Thanks for that. So Jody, I think you mentioned there are some immigration issues or perhaps challenges in the regions or in Côte-Nord more specifically.
Yes, we do have immigration. I would say probably just the Filipino community is probably, I would consider the English-speaking immigrated groups that's coming through the Côte-Nord. I am not too much into the statistics around, what their needs are, but I could say that I'm more a little bit informed around Indigenous In the Cotentin region, we have one English-speaking First Nations, which is found north near Shefferville at the Kawachikamak. And what we see here, I think, is the challenges there is education. Education where post-secondary education is like many of the other communities in the regions, they would have to leave in order to pursue future studies. Then again, there is we have a tendency to see some of the indigenous population that are living off reserve. And when I say off reserve, just going south to the city of Sept-Îles, where they are living amongst population. And again, there, it's the education-wise, there is the barrier of not having adequate French in order to get a job. So for the challenges for the Indigenous community in my region, the English-speaking First Nations, I would say, is, again, vocational attainment, post-secondary attainment, and the language, acquiring adequate skills, French skills, written communication skills in order to get onto the job market.
Okay, I'll just add a little on to, I think, Yigal and Jody's points. I think from my experience of interviewing people who were either racialized or came from a First Nations background, a lot of people said that they felt that being an English speaker was sort of, another added layer of barrier between them and the majority culture in Quebec. And for some people, and not all, this had an impact on how they navigated the workforce. Again, I think it's important to add the nuance here so we're not essentializing like Yigal mentioned. For example, I spoke to one participant who was South Asian, who had very strong French language skills. And she said she feels that people kind of assume that she is sort of an English-speaking immigrant who can't speak French. She's read as sort of like an English speaker, even though she's functionally fluent. So when she applied for jobs, she'd apply for jobs in French companies. She, could submit an application in French, write a cover letter in French, and then turn up to the interview, and she could tell that they were not expecting a South Asian woman to turn up. They were expecting probably someone who was white. And again, this is one person's experience. Other people who are in similar positions did not have this at all. But I think, for her at least, it was that language and her race were sort of compounding issues. And I think that's important to kind of think about.
Dr. Borey, anything you'd like to add?
On this last point, you mentioned there's the research by Eid, who does testing. He sends out CVs that are equivalent, other than the family name of the candidate, and he finds very systematically that people who have non-francophone names are not as likely to get the first interview, which is the most important first step for getting a job. So I'm just saying there's a lot of data on that in Quebec and in Canada. The same patterns do occur in the rest of Canada and in France and Europe. So that's the difficulty of, in terms of intersectionality, of being visible minority, of having different language skills, speaking French or English with an accent. All these things are factors that make those people more vulnerable to prejudice and discrimination. There's no other word for it.
And Dr. Borey, as far as you know, have there been any studies with those CV testing done for English versus French in Quebec?
Good point. The research that he did was not looking specifically at French English. I can give you some results from the Vaillancourt study if it's appropriate now. Otherwise, I'll
Please do, yeah.
I'll do it later.
Okay. Well, your call.
Okay. Okay. So again, it's Professor Vaillancourt. He calculated the economic advantages of being a French-English bilingual for Anglophone and Francophones in Quebec using mother tongue, because it's older data. And of course, with the PERT team, we're using first official language spoken. But these are little hints for further studies in the PERT group. You guys got a lot on your plate.
We're
It's
taking
great.
notes,
It's
I'm pretty
great.
sure.
So he used data from 1971, 2001, and 2011, okay, the census data. He controlled, and that was the hard part, he controlled for level of education, years of experience at work, and number of weeks worked in Quebec for both the Francophone and Anglophone bilinguals and for the Francophone unilinguals. He used as a baseline the median annual income of French mother tongue unilinguals in each of the census periods. So that's your baseline, okay? Here's what he found for French mother tongue bilinguals. In 1971, French mother tongue bilinguals earned 12.6% more income than French mother tongue unilinguals. In 2001, French mother tongue bilinguals earned 12.2% more income than French unilinguals. In 2011, French mother tongue bilinguals earned 7% more than French unilinguals. So as expected, French mother tongue bilinguals gained an economic advantage for learning English and becoming bilingual. What happened to the English mother tongue speakers who became bilingual from 1971 to 2011? So here's what he found. In 1971, English mother tongue speakers who became French-English bilinguals earned 10% more than the annual salary of the French mother tongue unilinguals. So an economic advantage for Anglophones becoming bilinguals before Bill 101 in Quebec. But by 2001, English mother tongue speakers who were bilingual earned 18% less in annual income than French mother tongue unilinguals. And by 2011, English mother tongue speakers who were bilingual earned 10% less than the French unilinguals. For Quebec Anglophone minorities, becoming bilingual was not rewarded economically by 2001 and 2011. And those were pretty solid data from Canadian Census, but it's hard research, but I can set you up with Mr. Vaillancourt. Given the ascendancy, so here are some hypotheses. Given the ascendancy of the Francophone majority and greater status of French in Quebec society, why reward an Anglophone minority for knowing French as the language of the majority, from the point of view of the majority group, Francophones? And also, why reward Anglophones for knowing English, which is their mother tongue? But Quebec Francophones are still rewarded economically for knowing English as bilinguals from 1971 to 2011. But why should the bilingualism of the Francophone majority be better rewarded financially than the bilingualism of the Anglophone minority? That's a fair question. Perhaps the Francophone majority can afford to benefit their own kind for being bilingual rather than rewarding minorities for being bilingual. By the way, similar trends emerged for allophones. They were not rewarded for learning French and becoming bilingual. So to conclude, income differentials between the majority and minority language communities remain sensitive issues, and it must be researched much more now with the more recent census data. So that's the query that we have, and I don't doubt the research done by Vaillancourt on these disadvantages, even for bilinguals and for Anglophone bilinguals relative to French unilinguals. Thank you.
So if I was to sum that up, despite our community learning French to a certain degree, a certain level of bilingualism for the English-speaking community, we're not being rewarded financially for it.
Yeah.
Okay. And the French language issue, as touched on in our presentation, is complicated. By far, it's the number one barrier we hear from the community itself when they talk about employment barriers. And again, the measure of bilingualism is, can you have a conversation? And you can talk about les habitants in a bar with somebody, or perhaps order a coffee, but can you talk about, a complex engineering project, or how to stitch someone up in French? And those are kind of two separate things. So we think about professional vocabulary. We also think about confidence. Vous avez la français de base, but can you actually speak fluently and confidently in a professional scenario? And you get up in front of people, for example, and even in English, it can be a challenge, right? Or a bit of a nerve-wracking experience. So Abby, I'm gonna come back to you, but I'd love to hear from the other participants, just on the French language barriers, challenges. Do you have anything else to add, Jody or Yigal?
I just, in rereading the profile for the Côte-Nord, I did notice that those English speakers that identified themselves as bilingual were paid much less. And we are encouraging, to be bilingual and be able to communicate properly in both language. But yeah, just with Dr. repeating that, it just brought back to what I was reading through the Profile 5 report. So there's questions there where we're being paid less, and we are, we're proficient in both languages, oral and written, but the salary's not there. So that's very concerning.
Just 2 points. The law to learn French in 6 months, we think we can all laugh at that. I would challenge people in the government to try and learn Arabic in 6 months fluently. We'll see how well they do. Also, just to say, not everybody is good with languages. I'm someone who's really, I'm very good at functionally learning a language. I went to Spain and I learned how to speak in Spanish in 1 month, but I've been trying my whole life to master French, and I'm very far away from it, and I'm born here. So I think that is also something that people tend to forget. It's hard to languages. People who are neurodiverse, people have intellectual barriers. Language is not easy for many, many people. So to ask people to, learn a language to that depth, and to pass exams, which most of the native French population here can't pass, is kind of ridiculous. And I think we know what it is, but again, without saying too much, it's important just to remember the languages are hard. My participants try really hard to learn French. It's really hard for them. If you're coming from China, to go from Mandarin to French is a big jump, and they do extremely well, but they're still not going to be it's going to take years, so it's important to remember that.
Perfect. Abby, do you have anything to add on the French language piece?
Well, actually, what I was going to talk about next. Oh, sorry.
Okay, perfect. Then move into that.
It's pretty perfect. Yeah.
Okay. Then go for it.
Okay, cool. So I will just share more about my research that I've referenced before. So like I said, I interviewed 30 English speakers from across Quebec in seven different regions, and from various backgrounds, be that employment, education, location, race, ethnicity. It was a very diverse group. And the goal of this was to highlight both the collective and the individual experiences of English speakers as they navigate the workforce. And so something I found, kind of what we're talking about in my research, was that most participants cited French language skills as their greatest barrier to entering the workforce. And even though most people were very keen to learn French, they could not access French classes that were functional for them or worked for them or affordable. And so these collective issues were shared among most of the participants, but they looked very different for different people on the individual level. So I'll just talk about a couple of people to show that. So, for example, I spoke to one participant who moved to Quebec from another province without knowing any French. Prior to moving, she was working in a creative industry and had built up, very specialized skills over the course of her career. And when she moved, she went to an employment services center where they told her, because you don't know French, you can work at a farm picking mushrooms, or you can work as a maid in a hotel. And this was devastating for her. She had a whole career, and now it meant nothing because she didn't know French. And she tried to find classes, but said that at the time she thought she wasn't eligible for subsidized classes because she was born in Canada. Now, that's not true, but she couldn't find out for herself because the websites that she was looking on were in French. And it was only when she made friends with a French speaker who did the research for her, did she find out that she was in fact eligible for subsidies. And she enrolled in classes, and she eventually did find a job where they're now sort of, they're supporting her in learning French, and she feels very supported at work. But it was a very difficult process for her. It really got the sense of how grueling it was. Conversely, spoke to another participant who was born in Quebec. He went to school sort of in an English medium school. But learned French throughout his life. But despite this, he never really gained, full fluency. He says he's pretty conversational, but he doesn't think he could work fully in French. Despite this, he actually ended up finding work relatively easily out of university. But he says to move up in his career, to sort of take that next step, he really needs to improve his French. But he just can't seem to find a class that's right for him. The first thing is that because he's born in Quebec, at the moment he's not eligible for a government subsidized class, so they're unaffordable to him. The second thing is that because he has sort of this pre-existing base, and he wants to quote unquote fine-tune his skills, he can't really find anything that does that for him. Everything is sort of at the basic level. He's really struggling to get to that next level through classes, or find a class that would help him do that. So all this to say is that maybe in a collective sense, these two participants have similar problems. They need to improve their French language skills, and they need to they have had difficulty finding a class or accessing training that enables them to improve these skills. But when you look at the individual level, it's vastly different. And not to sound too cheesy, but this is why going beyond the numbers is important, because the collective experience, the numbers tell us one thing, but individually there's such a diversity of needs and issues that you need to kind of dig deeper a little bit.
Dr. Brohy, go for it.
Okay. So I think that there's a lot of work to help the majority francophones be more open to linguistic diversity within French. So accents of different backgrounds is like music of French, because different accents is like musical tones that vary. So there's a lot of work to be done with the Francophone majority to help them see how different people from different parts of the world come in and they learn French with different accents and different expressions, and that can help. At UQAM, we've had a program of jumelage interculturel, intercultural twinnings, so that we take students, immigrants who have done a lot of learning in French, but they're still taking the courses. And then we pair them with undergraduate students who are Québécois francophones, and we get them to meet for 1 or 2 hours during class time. And that really helps to break the glass, you could say break the ice. It helps them to, it helps the francophones to appreciate how much immigrants have traversed in order to come to Canada and to Quebec. So we try to do it at the interpersonal level, but it's a slow process, because it's just one-on-one or duo and duo. It's a long process. So we've had about 15,000 jumelages interculturels in the last 12 years, which is still not a lot compared to all the people who are struggling to learn French from different parts of the world. So that's one way of doing it, but it's really not institutional. It's something based on a voluntary basis. Okay.
Yeah, thank you for that. So what I'm hearing is the English-speaking community does want to learn French or improve their French, improve their confidence, but there are lots of barriers there, and there's work to be done and things we can do to improve, and hint for tomorrow, by the way. So we're trying to move beyond the data. We like to reuse our catchy terms here at PERT, and obviously we know quantitative data has holes and it doesn't tell the whole picture. So you'll be invited this afternoon to obviously share some of your stories and share some kind of qualitative information that you might have for us, and we'll be collecting that and compiling that in various notes. But I'm just wondering, for the panelists, do you have any stories, because those stories can be really powerful, about people in your communities, people that you work with or that you serve in your employment service, as employment service providers, that you want to share?
I've got quite a few, but I'll just pick and choose. And I think I think amongst the English-speaking community, we don't want to be known as people who complain and make complaints. We don't want to be taken as that. But in my conversations with individuals in my region and just trying to understand the gaps in the services and why they're not trying to find employment, in some of my conversations, it did come up where they did speak French, but they felt they didn't get the job because they had the English accent. And I've been hearing that quite often. And then I had another story from somebody that was looking inside of a health facility to get a job, whether it was into the kitchen, it was into the cleaning department, and went through the whole process and the interview, and wasn't high school leaving was the requirement for that. Unless she was told, "I'm sorry, we can't hire you." Why not? Because you can't communicate well in French. Well, I really don't need the skills if I'm going to be folding laundry. So we're hearing stories like that. Then, through our work, through the employability strategy, and before that, in trying to build relationships and partnerships with the employability providers in our region through RDN, and just trying for them to sensitize them about, the concerns and how to approach English speakers, and working, with Services Quebec and setting up systems in order to properly accommodate and increase the accessibility for English speakers to come and inquire and get support to help them put them on the job market. I had some stories where we really set up a system in one of the cities on the North Shore where we put reception and admission into an employability partner, and so to go in and they would be able to assist them in English. I was really proud of it, and working at the regional office, and we put in a system. This is going to be like a pilot. I sent somebody there because she was looking for a job, and I said, "Well, why don't you go here and you're going to be answered in English and all this." So she did go. She's a young 25-year-old from Northern Ontario, moved to the Cotenald because her spouse had a job and she followed him. Was on mat leave when she moved to Quebec, and then she was looking for employment. Sent her there. And I built up her confidence. Don't worry, you're going to be answered in English. They're really going to help you. I've been working on this. Sent her. She was answered in English, and then the person that was receiving her had asked her, "You're French? Do you speak French?" "No, but I'm learning. I'm trying to learn." "Well, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm going to send you across the street." Across the street was Alpha Lyra, and they work with immigration, and they give Francization courses. "You go across the street first, and you learn your French, and then you come back and talk to me." The young girl sat in her car in the parking lot and cried. I called her to see, "And how did it go?" The anxiety levels built up. She said, "I cried." And she said, "I did not feel welcome." So I think there's something that needs to be done around the area of those that are providing the services and employability to have our Quebecers on the job market. They need to be a little bit more sensitized about the English-speaking community, and to put in where they're able to receive them. And I know in my region, English speakers are not seeking support from these provincial entities that's been put in place because there's a lack of awareness. They cannot service them in English. So what's happening is they're coming to a generalist organization like ours, which we are not professionals in that area. We're professionals in building partnerships, collaborations, but we can't help them. And I think this is something that has to be done. That has to be done within, the public sectors, the government of Quebec. Another thing that maybe I'm taking a little bit pointer because I've got a passion for my community, and I speak from the heart. Is that we always say bottom up. Okay, if you want to make an impact into community, it's bottom up. It got to come from the community, and then it's, well, when it comes to communicating and informing and giving directions, I think sometimes it has to be top down, where it's coming from the government and it's informing their employability providers that, they should reach out to the English-speaking community, or even welcome them, have understanding of them. There are challenges because in a few instances I've got thrown in Bill 96, and no, that didn't go over well. So I think if our government, through Services of Quebec, the Minister of Emploi or something, that there has to be something that comes from the top down, that goes down and talks directly to these regional or these local centres d'emploi. Like I said, there's lots and lots of stories, but it's sometimes it's very challenging, and it just breaks the hearts to hear some of the stories, how they're really trying to get a job, trying to improve their French, and sometimes they're basically the door is shut in their face. So that's about it.
Thank you. And it's okay to speak from the heart. The first presentation was for the mind, and this panel's for the heart. Okay. So does anyone have any other stories they'd like to add? It doesn't have to be about French language barriers, but, Yigal, go ahead.
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Jody was saying. Just my interactions with Emploi Quebec. Again, I'm not going to talk too much. I've been at the office, and I remember talking to someone at the office and saying, look, some of my participants are almost going to be homeless. And getting an answer, well, if they're homeless, it's because they want to be homeless. So it wasn't surprising to get that answer, because I interact a lot. I think that people who are higher up, I just thought of an idea, Nicholas. We should invite people who are making these decisions to actually come into the community for a week and, participate in a program and see how it is, because I think there is a disconnect, like you were saying, between...
It's okay to clap too, folks.
between those, and I think if they did come in, our program is amazing. It's better than any TV show I've seen. Honestly, it starts, and we have a small group of about 16 people in our PPE, and the first day everybody looks very nervous and they're sitting around, and literally by the second week they're all really close. Like it's amazing to see, and these are people from every single different background, race, ethnicity, the religion. It's crazy, and within a week, by the end of the 6 months, they're supporting each other. Even before that, and it's interesting to watch them go through life. People get sick in their families. Something happens. They have health issues. And everybody supports each other, and people that you would never think. We have people who come from certain countries where being LGBTQ is like with the devil or something, and they open up eventually. We have workshops, but it's not through the workshops, it's through sitting next to someone who is LGBTQ in the workshop, it's interesting, we don't mind talking about politics and religions in our group. We let it go because that's what people need, and it kind of brings them closer together. They can go beyond what keeps them apart. And I think this is what needs to be done. It's kind of tying the jumelage, what you were saying. I really love that idea. I think it's such an important idea. And I'm never sure what the fear is with the people who are putting restrictions in this province. What is the fear? This is like a 50-year-old fear, which shouldn't really exist anymore. When you talk to young people, they don't seem to have it. So who is keeping these rules, these draconian ideas alive, and why? What's their fear? And I think if they can realize that there is no fear, that's only, like you said, many musical, the accents are different. I love that. It's going to enrich Quebec. It's going to make Quebec even better, rather than everybody leaving Quebec having a brain drain, which will happen again. I think the people don't realize right now it's good, but I have friends who came from France and they want to leave, and they come and they're kind of shocked at how things work here as well. They're not overly impressed. So they're going to leave, and they're actually a lot more bilingual than a lot of the unilingual French people here. So what I don't understand is, what is the barrier? What is the fear? There is no fear, really. What I see in my group after a few weeks is there's no fear. So I think if we can extend that to government a little bit, it could really help the actual process, the actual numbers.
Abby, Dr. Bory. So I'm going to just ask you a final question here. What's missing from the data, in your opinion? So what kind of labor-related data would you like to see?
I mean, just more data would be nice. The census only comes around every few years. It'd be nice to have some consistent data. You know, we're talking about 2021 numbers, and it's 2023. So I think that.
Anything else to add?
I think it's the timing of the census. You know, it's usually the month of May, and we have for the unemployment rate. I think if the data was conducted in the month of April, you'll probably see higher unemployment rates, especially in some of the coastal communities. When I look into Gaspé des Îles, des Îles de Madeleine, the Côte-Nord, where these are seasonal. So I think if the data was conducted in the month of April early, and not that May the 1st, you'll probably see higher unemployment rates amongst the English-speaking community.
I'll just add also just more qualitative data, and even outside of paper, like videos. I know it seems obvious, because most people don't know how to respond to data. They see numbers, it's fine, but they respond to stories. We talk about this all the time. If you ask for stories, so when you hear a story, you understand the data much better. So, just to make a few videos about people in all the regions, like everybody we've been talking about here today, where you can share the data, have the numbers on the screen, and have some testimonials, have some videos of the people, where they live, how they work, see their face. I think that could be really good.
Sounds like we have the premise for a reality show, perhaps.
Definitely.
Anything else on the data? All right, well, I want you to just join me in thanking our panelists, giving them a round of applause for sharing their opinion today. Thank you, everyone.